Okay, thank you, David. So hello again, everybody. It's my pleasure this week to welcome Laura Alexander from the National Autistic Society, and she's currently based at the Autism Research Centre in Glasgow. She's come to speak to us about autism in adolescence. She's got a lot of experience working in further education, supporting people with additional learning needs and so on. And she's also a mother of an autistic son. So thank you, Laura, for joining us. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say to us today.
Thank you, Hannah. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I hope I don't disappoint. What I'm going to do is share my screen so that you can follow the PowerPoint. And hopefully that will...
We can see that.
There we go. It's all seen. Right, so just one small correction, Hannah. It's not the Autism Research Centre, it's the Autism Resource Centre. We're not, we're much humbler than that establishment in Cambridge, the Autism Research Centre, another ARC, but we are indeed the Glasgow ARC. And what we do offer to individuals, to families and professionals is information, training and advice around all things to do with autism. So the ARC really came about from the one-stop shops that were set up across Scotland that were first piloted in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Unfortunately, the vision of 2004 has changed quite a bit in 2021. So my post and the ARC itself have evolved quite a bit. We have filled, and my post filled a gap in provision. What happened in 2006 was acknowledgement that a third of referrals to the ARC, which was a multidisciplinary service, a third of the referrals came from the 16 to 25-year-old age group. And many of my colleagues would admit they didn't really want to work with teenagers. And I applied for the role on a job share basis. So it was a shared post in 2006, and the remit was to work with young people in a group setting and develop a programme that could roll on. And the name we come up with was Me, Myself and ASD. We very rarely gave it the full title, and obviously over the years the D bit, the disorder bit, had less appeal than condition, which fitted nicely with the group that evolved, which was MASC. We also had to support individuals with appointments and home visits. Now, however, I am not delivering Me, Myself and ASD, so I'm talking from a perspective of the historical perspective, and now the role is to work alongside social workers and health staff on what they term the high tariff cases. So it's a different role, and this is to meet with the financial constraints that affected all one-stop shops across Scotland. Okay, so this course, Me, Myself and ASD, had certain aims and objectives. From our point of view, it was to help young people have an understanding of this label that they had been given. So knowledge of what autism was, and to work through with them how they thought they related to this, and along the way to develop strategies that would help them, not to, as someone suggested, make them neurotypical, but to help them cope with a world that was almost 99% neurotypical. A byproduct of that was to give them some opportunities to make friends, to be in a group that wasn't similar to their school setting, which they would be very much in a minority. So it's to widen these opportunities. On the other hand, their aims and objectives of attending me, myself, and ASD was quite different. It ranged from no aims and objectives at all to those who wanted to learn more about autism, despite the internet being available, and those that said they wanted to make friends. Those that said none were told to come. When we asked the question on week 1, why are you here? Gave them an opportunity to give us a variety of answers. We did hear, my mother made me, my teacher thought it'd be good for me, my social worker told me to. In fact, one girl was paid to attend, and I'll let you guess maybe which one that is from the case studies we're looking at later. The making friends bit, one young man, Alan, said that he would have met the boy Tony anyhow. He would have met him, even if he hadn't attended. In fact, he told us in his feedback that he could have got all this off the internet and he'd have met Tony anyhow. So we couldn't really explain to him that that might not have been the case. So what were the outcomes of doing group work with adolescents? I've divided that into 3 groups. I think it's important to look at each individually. So who helped facilitate the work? Who were the participants? And obviously, because of the age range, there would be parental involvement as well. So the facilitators, there were, as I said, 2 of us. If there hadn't been 2 of us in post, I very much doubt the programme would have ever got off the ground, because although we were funded from education and social work, one half, and then health, our health colleagues disappeared. They weren't around to help with this group, this post-diagnostic support. So the facilitators came from varying groups. They came from people who had a vested interest in autism, maybe wanted to learn more about it within their professional capacity. So we had teaching staff that were based within the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service within CAMS. And that was great as far as, or for as long as they existed, because 2 or 3 years into the work, their posts were all cut. We did have other teachers. We tended to have teachers who had a personal interest in autism. So we had mothers and siblings, tended to be sisters, that very often their facilitators were female. So they would, in their own time, come along and help facilitate. We also had a social worker or 2, and we had, in the main, trainee psychologists. So they might already be working within a CAMS service, but looking to expand their knowledge and understanding of autism. And with the young people's permission, they were within that group. And 1 or 2 others who had an interest. In fact, the voluntary sector also wanted to have experience so that they could better support the young people, young autistic adults they worked with. So that was quite a wide range of facilitators, and every one of them gave really positive feedback about being involved. It did improve their understanding of the issues for young people, and they also saw them in a different setting from the one that they might have been more used to. And there was a much more honest feedback from the young people through the discussion groups and through the exercises we did. Of the participants themselves, well, they were all individuals, and the feedback from them was varied. Occasionally there were friendships that we thought might last. By far the most positive feedback around their meeting people was that they weren't alone. Yes, some of them gained knowledge, but it was that they knew they weren't alone. The risk alongside that was the odd comment like, I know I'm not like him or them, and sometimes I'm not as bad as him or them or her, whatever. So that was varied. The parents gave, I would say, more positive feedback. How they managed that, I'm not sure. I think they were glad that their young person wanted to come back to stay attending and that they seemed to be learning, but I'm not sure what they shared with their parents, because not one of them would take their workbooks away with them. Some of them because they didn't want to be seen with this MMASD notebook, but they all most accepted that workbook with all its strategies, all the work we've done, and their certificate of attendance at the end of the 7-8 week course, whatever length of time they attended. The thing they looked forward to the most was the comments from their peer group. We set up something on the last day so that they could, in the time that they'd got to know everybody else, they all had to say something positive about another person in the group, and we had a way of collecting all that information. So that was the certificate they very much wanted to see. Let me see about the gaps now. There were gaps, and if anything, I would like today to help with the filling of the gaps, because along the way, that's what the job always looked like to me. And I've been fortunate in that when we've seen gaps, we have striven to do something about them. And there are many gaps in services, and there are many gaps in knowledge and understanding. So the first one that I want to identify is that we did miss out those that did not have an autism profile of Asperger's syndrome. I would say the majority of attendees, by necessity, probably had to fit that profile. There were one or two that did not have that diagnosis, and I'll talk about them in the case studies. However, that in itself, as a parent, did bother me. My son's own diagnosis would not make him able to join in that sort of setting, nor learn or grow from that knowledge. My son's diagnosis is childhood autism, the label that will remain whatever age he becomes. And he, since the age of 2, has been non-verbal. We communicate sometimes more effectively than others. Certainly in the past year, not effectively at all, but we use gesture, we use concise language as a family and other caregivers, and we use reading because he does read. He just doesn't put into words his thoughts and answers. So there were one or two students, and me myself, who did not fit our version of the Asperger's profile. Quite quickly, age restrictions became an issue, because once you start delivering to the 16 plus, somebody's 15, 14, 13, and there were a lot of demands in our service to move further away from an adult provision. And it just highlighted that there is a gap. Autistic adolescents do not get the recognition they deserve to be a group that has independent needs, that has something that is neither a child service, child with autism, or autistic adult. So we said to our colleagues within the adult autism team, it'd be good if you kept the adults. So I think we got it down to the over 20s. We tried to push towards them. And we worked with 18 to 20s, 16 to 18s, and then 14 to 16-year-olds. And we did have to keep a careful eye on how each young person operated, how they understood what was going on, were they in the right group. So there's a lot of pre-interview stuff had to go on before they were recruited, no matter how long they'd been in our waiting list. It was finding the right group dynamic. There were also issues around gender identity. Back in 2006, the statistics, the ratios rather, were very much 5 males, 1 female. And over the years, we saw that shift as the identification of females got better, how they present in the spectrum. But within that, we had very obvious identity issues in the young people that we were meeting. So you would have the odd female who said, I'm fine with being with these geeky boys, I'm one of them, and others who could not attend a group that was male or even a mix. So we found ourselves delivering female-only courses, which was really relatively groundbreaking at the time. There was also the risk that we might do more harm than good. That's because you can highlight for young people, when you put any list up of these are the difficulties people with autism face, to them assuming that they are going to get or catch all of these. So it was always a balancing act. How can we make sure that we are saying this might be the case, because the very word might or may is much harder for an autistic thinker to accept than maybe the parents or professionals. So always that fine line. Very quickly, I wanted to make sure that we were balancing the reality check of a diagnosis of autism with keeping our self-esteem up, or making sure that we could give more self-esteem and more praise and recognition of skills and gifts. The other big gap that came alongside running Me, Myself and ASD was running a programme for parents alongside it. We managed to do that with a very keen team in one area of Glasgow who had within the CAM service enough staff who were motivated, again, to give up their own time, it has to be said, to work with the parents. So one of the settings was a college in Glasgow for delivering the course, and the parents used another classroom. So when we were talking communication or sensory or anxiety, whichever the topic was, the parents would, in theory, be following a similar topic. Although very quickly, one particular parents group directed the things they wanted to talk about went a bit off-piste. But that was fine because the two facilitators were knowledgeable and able to go along with them. What has happened now is the focus of my role has shifted to support the parents to understand their children better, because as services have disappeared and other changes have come in, it usually does fall back on the parents to do something differently, and they are more than willing to attend. Another programme that we ran had some interesting outcomes, which I'll maybe save for the latter part of today. Okay, so what did the group experience look like, and what were the issues? Well, in the very first case, getting young people there. never mind getting it right for them, getting them there. I do remember one girl who turned up for the first course and couldn't leave the car. And I found myself in a car park on a cold wintry evening trying to persuade her, not having been able to meet her before the course, persuade her that it was okay for her to join. But she had noticed a boy at her school was going in. She wanted nothing to do with him, and she certainly didn't want him knowing that she had this thing called autism. So she didn't come in. She did, in fact, attend 2 courses after that and asked to come back when she was older. One of the issues I found quickly was she was only 13, and there was definitely issues over working in a younger and younger age group. So we learned along the way. Could the room be right for every student, or the venue, or the timing? Obviously, there were issues there around where it quite clearly couldn't be the school that they attended. So if it was held in their area rather than a citywide group, then it had to be in a place that didn't have a lot of baggage went with it. One of the vice principals at a college was persuaded to give us the twilight period between their day classes and their evening classes, and said, I know that this doesn't mean I'm going to get these students. You're not going to persuade them that suddenly I will have many applicants attending this college just because they've attended this group. But he did actually have, I remember, 1 or 2 boys who, once they were over the door, thought, I could come here, this is okay. They weren't maybe seeing it when it was really busy. But we tended to have premises that were free because we didn't have the budgets that went with running them in nice venues with plenty of catering, etc. So what I was aware of, no matter which course, was that there was a very strong atmosphere of anxiety on week 1. You tended to find, in the room, you could feel the anxiety and the stress. And the facilitators, when we got together, and for our debrief sessions, would always say, when we got to week 2 or 3, it's really different from week 1. So that collective tension, no matter how self-assured and confident the young people appeared, there were issues. So one girl in particular, one of the case studies, had to have the room right for her. So she arrived about 2 weeks before her course was due to start with her mother, had to see the room to know where she was sitting, to know that nobody would touch her or be near her, and what the format, what she would be expected to do. And we made every effort to make sure that was the case. I'll maybe talk later about some of the more challenging aspects of making sure we got it right for her. Making sure students came back to week 2 often involves some one-to-one support and checking in with the person that had referred them. And I do remember one young man in particular who I was sure would come back, as were the other facilitators, but did not. And with each new issue and with each new student participant, you realised and learnt what you needed to know, preferably yesterday. But all stood in good state, and we all did learn as we went along. And then there comes a point when you reach the end of the course that you have to help them with the next transition stage, which is moving on. We did have an opportunity for the social groups, which, the social friendships, and then moving on with 1 or 2 others. We got some funding and we worked with Strathclyde Autistic Society, and they supplied a facilitator and some volunteers. to run the social groups. In another case, parents set one up because the group had gelled so well. I think that was one of the groups that had a parent session alongside. And these parents made sure that they attached themselves to a carer centre, and they allowed a very mixed group of young men, it has to be said. I think that group was entirely male, but they wanted to give them every opportunity to build on what had started through attending Me, Myself and ASD. So moving on from that group, the Strathclyde Autistic Society ran a few social groups for adults, and the difficulty was always helping people move on from that group to a mainstream social opportunity. But we did our best, and obviously some of these things were not sustainable in the long run because funding doesn't go alongside that. So the actual course required a lot of planning and required recruitment to get the right age group and the right mix. Very difficult to do. People were thrust upon us sometimes. We did get urgent referrals, all sorts of things that changed the dynamics, even from the planning stage. We built the course into 7 sessions. So once you get past that tense week one, we could look at the topics in a very set format. The students themselves would choose the group rules. They would answer through the third person, so they were actually interviewing each other, and lots of games and activities that gave them a way of engaging without it being all about them or never about them. The courses were usually held in the early evening. One of the social work courses, I think, was in a school holiday period, but that was quite intense. We were piloting, can we do more than one session a week? No, it was too much. I think we learned from that. So tended to be in the twilight hours, sort of 5 o'clock till 7. Had to be after school with enough of a downtime so they could then attend, but not too much, then attend. The venue had to be neutral, as I said earlier, not their school, maybe our own, maybe the Autism Resource Centre. Sometimes that wasn't the ideal venue. I remember one time Glasgow's Education Service headquarters was used because it was considered central for them all to reach easily, independent travellers. We've used colleges, we used community centres, basically anywhere that was not going to cost us a lot of money. We aimed to have 6 to 8 young people in a group, and that actually did require 2 or 3 facilitators. What would tend to happen is the one facilitator would give the introductions and the first topic, for example. And the other woman would be managing the group, keeping an eye on, was everybody engaging? Were there any issues? Sometimes having to leave the room if somebody was emotional in any way, either upset or angry, whatever. And 3 was actually an even better number, but not always easy to find. We had to have a fairly predictable format with rules, with structure, everything that would make sense and would seem, yes, I know what I'm turning up to this week, this is okay, even though the topics changed every week. And very importantly, the facilitators always had a debrief session at the end and followed up with any issues. So quite an intense exercise. At this point, I think it'd be good to have a pause for reflection on the first question that I asked on the sheet, if anybody managed to have a look at it. But that is to think of what unmet needs you might have identified in your current knowledge and understanding of autistic adolescents. I know there's a wide range of research programs, but at this point, just to have a pause for a bit of a comfort break, what you think you know already specifically around adolescence. And then we're going to move on to, I believe, some breakout time, and we're going to look at question 2, which is the case studies that you were sent, and to identify within these case studies where you think our priorities had to be, or where you would put priorities in, and what sort of support would be the reason you prioritise particular applicants to work with. When you are working with individuals for research purposes, there will be a variety of ways of reaching them. It won't all be visual and it won't all be verbal. It will embrace some of the other issues that we see regularly. And I'm going to come back to that towards the end when we look at unmet needs being sensory, a much wider spectrum, although much less supported than autism, and anxiety and stress itself. So if you could pause for a bit just to identify your own, and then bring that to the group setting when we break out into rooms. So I think I might need to stop sharing at that point and check that we're able to go into breakout rooms. So thank you all for doing that. It was just to give some sort of focus and really to give a flavour of the range, if you like, of young people that I have worked with over the years. I'll try and refer to their profiles as we go along, but number one actually had had 2 attempts to attend a group session. She was the person I mentioned earlier who wouldn't get out of the car. So her anxiety and her need for the support that was her sister. And in fact, when she was older, and it's why I was always slightly nervous of us going down the age range, when she was older, she asked to do the course again as a 16-year-old. Very clever girl, but had the idea that she didn't fit in unless she put down her skills, and chose to be interested in what she thought her peer group were all interested in, all the sort of beauty and makeup and things like that. And unfortunately, she wasn't a natural beautician. I do encounter that a lot in some of the young girls I've worked with. Number 2 is actually someone that, for all that she was there, but she struggled with friendship, she is doing fine. And I think a lot of her issues were around the move to high school and sharing friends with other, her best friend from primary school. She just didn't want to expand the friendship group, and moving on from a group where when we spoke about in weeks 3 and 4, we covered friendships and relationships, and very much what came out was the need for rules, and when rules get broken, how that ended friendships. So there's a lot came out of that particular girl's input. And then we have the number 3, Claire, who had to, the one I mentioned earlier, had to attend and find out everything to do with the room layout and where she was going to be. And of all the difficult groups, number 4 was in the same group as her. And he needed to high five and hug everybody he met. And we'd already established the rules for nobody touch me, nobody sit next to me, and inbounded number 4. And managing that was a situation in itself. So right away, it was the only time I really had to forcefully intervene, say, you know, hand up and no hugging. This is not happening because this doesn't please the other person. I have to say one of the other solutions for having number 4 in the group, because yes, he did need to be there because he, like the others, wanted to have more friends, didn't have the same opportunities attending the type of school he did. And if I'm honest, I think his mother saw it as respite, dropping him off before she left. So we had one member of staff who sat with him and was the person that got the high fives and the hugs and the buffer, basically, for the rest of the group. But that was one of my more interesting groups when I look back on it. And curiously enough, we've got to link 3, 4, and 5 because the quiet young man, whoever said, you know, absolutely, they still need attention. In this case, it's the quiet ones you have to watch for other reasons than some normal perception. His issue was processing time, and that came out in the very stylized format we had about everybody has a turn to speak and you do not speak when it's not your turn. You have to have permission from the speaker, which wasn't always me, it'd be the other student. If you were wanting to interrupt or say something, even the students, you said, but if it's in my head, I've got to say it. So that group together all happened, all these people, young people, all happened to be in that one group a few years back. And the issue for the quiet and polite young man was that he actually needed about 10 minutes processing time to answer a question. He had wonderful answers, and for all that some of the rest of the group struggled, he had a right to give his answer. So we'd be asking the one question around the circle, and when we came to the second, he would just be silent. But when we came to the second question, he wanted to answer the first one. So it was what that highlighted was, and we didn't know if schools were well aware of it because he was placed in a specialist schooling situation. It was in fact that he had quite a long verbal processing time. The suggestion somebody made in the chat about the nervous young man being a virtual attendee, he actually did benefit from being in the group. He had sensory issues, which in the feedback form at the end, he gave me credit, albeit in a weird third person wording, but he did give me credit for acknowledging his food sensory issues. So when we asked them on the second last week what kind of food they wanted to have for our version of a party, he chose wrapped food. He wanted to have mini rolls, things that were covered. And I had obviously been used to a lot of sensory issues from previous courses with my home setting. Quite happily went and purchased food, you know, treats and things that came covered. Box of sweets, wrapped sweets, mini rolls, and a box. We couldn't find something else that somebody had mentioned other than in an open box, sort of crispy cake things. And I offered him first pick of the open crispy cakes. And I encouraged him to take more than one, which he did. And then the other sweets were passed around, the other cakes and things. And his feedback said, "Thank you for allowing me to go first to choose the food." Because the second time we went round, because the box wasn't empty the first time, he wouldn't even consider choosing food that other people had touched. So that was a recognition of some of his sensory and anxiety issues. But knowing that also made me a bit nervous. When we did the tasting session one of the weeks, I was quite anxious of how he would participate and be involved. So much so that I actually spilt one of the ingredients on him. But he actually laughed. And in the peer group support, that was mentioned by more than one as a funny moment, but in a supportive way, not laughing at, but laughing with. So number 7, the Joker, actually had one of the highest support needs because that was a mask. 7 and 8 were both maskers. What they said and what they appeared to be like was nothing like what was going on underneath, but the rumbling volcano. So in number 7's case, he did not come back after week 1. Despite reassurances that people liked him and that he fitted in, they wanted to get to know him better. The complete mask, he couldn't handle that on another week. So there was more one-to-ones with the support staff for him. And for number 8, all that talk about hobbies and friends and fitting in, no, that was not the case. She was in fact paid to attend. And was apparently very, very difficult with her parent about coming along. And that came out through the other training session that was going on. Okay, so that's a summary of, and I'm seeing other comments that come up in the chat. So the common interest one I was going to pick up on from room 3, ask them what they want. One of the exercises we did was to have set questions that the young people could ask another person in the group they were paired off. And it was so that no one person hogged the conversation, but equally so that the other person it would give the information. So it wasn't about them if they didn't want to focus on them, and they weren't allowed to just spout forth about all their hobbies and interests. So what was interesting when we analysed that a bit more with them was how they did have interests in common, but they weren't alike, and that you're allowed to be different but have the same interests, or to be very similar and have completely different interests. And one of the funniest memories I have is of an earlier group where a boy told us he loved shopping. And because he had an interest in horror films, another person in the group thought, oh, he's my kind of person. But as soon as he said another interest was shopping, the face was, how can it be? How can you like shopping? In actual fact, in that particular instance, it was his mother's hobby. And I think because he always went with her, that is what he said. So what was said and the reality were often quite different things. And knowing beforehand would have been good, but nothing could ever prepare us for actually the ongoing working, and then knowing what that young person's perception of the question was, what their answers were really hiding. So yes, whoever identified the masking going on there. Okay, I'm going to go back and share my screen for the next slide. Okay, so we've just covered who you would support more, why, and what support. And what I will say is there is really no priority group there, because knowing the issues is more important than who gets a place when. Although the question of age that somebody brought up, we did really try and keep the ages apart, but you can have a fairly young 16, 17-year-old and a 15-year-old that might have fitted into the other group. So again, that sometimes was hit and miss. Okay, so what I've done is picked out some key themes that came from the working with the youngsters, and also in my college work and other group work I do, quite clearly I have identified that anxiety underpins a lot of the behaviours and the issues. In fact, in the training sessions we now do at the ARC, we always talk about anxiety before we ever talk about the word behaviour. And I think if people haven't already got a good understanding of sensory processing and all the issues that are around sensory, then you're not going to correctly identify where the behaviour comes from. So as one girl put it, I'm a volcano. I am going to erupt, but I don't know when. And I try to explain to her, neither does your mother or your teacher, but maybe we could identify a bit more information that might explain the whole volcanic eruption. Also needing to understand the processing of information. I've sat in on one-to-ones with the psychiatrist where the young person is very able verbally, apparently, but just stopping and saying, actually, what did the doctor mean by that? And exploring the answer versus the understanding. Another difficulty is when we have a comorbid condition, and that was highlighted. You might have noticed that the screen that I use is never black writing on white backgrounds. And one student I do remember who was unknown to the school, couldn't cope with black on white. So her reputation at school was for somebody that couldn't sit still, couldn't listen, always interrupting, but in actual fact, in a more supportive setting, was able to say, I can't look at that. And after attending the course, she did get tested for wearing glasses and for her sensory or visual processing. So although that felt like a small achievement, quite clearly the lost years at school where nothing like that was identified made me feel quite sad. Masking we've already spoken about. I would say never assume. There's always going to be the participants and the students in the group who are not, in fact, as confident as they seem. And the quiet ones as well, the low self-esteem, the reputation that's gone before a diagnosis, the reputation that sometimes goes with a diagnosis. I've said it was a balancing act to try and make sure that the young person has a reality of their situation, but equally is praised for their coping. Well done you for going in that really busy environment. Well done you for attending this group. Giving them the credit that is due to them. Because that is more important sometimes than the academic achievement that we tend to focus on. And let's not forget that the social impairments, as we still call them, do exist for themes, but there's been lots of research around social interaction, communication, and social imagination and flexibility of thought, rituals, routines, rhythms, etc. So possibly that's not a direction that you're taking, but I would like to think that for the obvious reasons of people I work with not coping, that we do need to start thinking about the other issues at the top. So I'm leaving you with a question that might come up within our Q&A that we are going to move on to next. But when you're looking at research, and certainly we do look, we don't produce it at the ARC in Glasgow, or I'm not directly involved within the National Autistic Societies, but the gaps that are there if you've identified anything and you are offering some research, does that in itself offer a positive outcome for the autistic young people of the future in their daily lives? So for me, it's always a case of what are the gaps, and let's not make any presumptions. And I say that because there are very real risks in working with the adolescent age group, that if we cannot find the right tools and the right resources to support them, and possibly along the way to change society attitudes, then we're not putting our own time and resources in the right place. On a positive note, there are agencies that do set out to find employment for autistic people, or to support employers to note the skill set, the attention to detail, the focus, the memory, all the skills and gifts that they can have from an autistic population. We help employers with that rather than with the barriers, why this person is difficult to work with or why they can't cope with a tea break situation. But what I do note from personal and professional experience is that I also meet the young people who are falling through the net, who don't fit in the age bands for services. They don't fit in that box. Or they don't meet the criteria for a particular service provision. If you don't have a learning disability, you don't get learning disability services. If you don't have a physical disability, you don't get physical support services, etc., and sensory as well. Sadly, I can think of a hearing of young people I might have known as a child who now are known to criminal justice services from domestic incidents where things have not gone well at home, and for whatever reason, police have been involved. And people who are very isolated, people who fit that, suddenly the statistics are real. The third who are likely to have low mental health episodes in their life. And that's not a comfortable position to be in, to find the statistics are true and that the services that people suddenly end up in aren't the ones that support them to be valued individuals, valued members of society. And I think that should be the goal that we all have. So really, that's where I want to pause just now. I don't know if we're needing another comfort break, but I'm going to hopefully now have a bit of a question and answer session, because what we've looked at up to now has been mainly my work with one particular support service for young autistic adolescents. I also have I worked in other areas, so quite happy that we have a Q&A that involves any of the above, what we've been talking about or some other areas. And I hope I've given you some food for thought about research paths of the future. I've given up my academic life. I'm a hands-on sort of person now. My studying days are over, so it's over to you as the next generation.